Okay, so Jonathan Marshall is one of our staffers with CCL. Maybe you can tell us a little bit of your story too, how you got in with CCL and then how you started working on the social cost of carbon. And yeah, we're excited to hear from you. And I think you should be able to share screen.
Great. Well, thank you all. I'm a former staffer of CCL.
Oh,
Uh, I was the economics research coordinator for a couple of years. Um, and as a volunteer, I contributed a lot of materials to the economics and policy page of Nerd Corner. So you can find various white papers and so on that relate to all manner of aspects about carbon pricing. I've written a book that's gone through two editions on carbon pricing, why we need it, how it's working, and how to build support, which is also available. You can download it. You can Google. I can find a link here if you want, or one of you can search for it and put a link in the chat. Excuse me. Uh, Earlier in my career, I was a journalist. I ended up as the economics editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. Uh, I've also worked in various communications roles for a number of companies, um, especially in the power and tech sectors. Um, but I've been involved with CCL for the past 8 years or so. And in the last year, I've shifted a little bit over to state level work in California, which seems a bit more rewarding politically than trying to beat my head against a wall on the national level. And trying to help fix some of California's uh, forward-looking climate policies, including its cap and trade program, which is up for reauthorization this year. So that's all very exciting work. And thank you for your invitation. I had written while I was kind of more active on CCL's forums and doing economics research for CCL, I had written on the social cost of carbon, which I think caught some of your attention. Uh, and so at your invitation, I put together a presentation, which I will launch into, unless some of you want to just have any questions before I begin. So, okay, I will see how this goes here. Great. Can you all see this?
yes.
Oh, that is a yes. Good. So just a few comments before I begin. Um, First of all, I didn't do any kind of thorough search here, but I did stumble across a presentation that some of you either helped prepare or heard on the health impacts of climate change and burning fossil fuels, which goes back to 2021. There's not a whole lot of overlap, but thematically there is some here, but there's a lot of newer information. Secondly, this presentation is somewhat heavy in its slides, and the reason is it doesn't make for an ideal delivered presentation, but I really saw this above all as a resource to leave behind with you, so you can kind of study it at your leisure to mine it for studies and data. Because I think the basic concepts most of you are either already know or are going to get pretty quickly. Thirdly, all of this is very relevant from a kind of theoretical policy perspective. It's temporarily a lot less relevant because President Trump has basically banned any use of the social cost of carbon in policymaking at the national level. And he's pretty much banned research on the impacts of climate change on health. So this presentation is not very administration friendly and maybe not very relevant to national policy for the next few years. But hopefully we will all keep some of these concepts alive, along with a great many other researchers. So with that, I will launch in. So I've thrown out this term, the social cost of carbon. Essentially, it's a single boil down measure of the economic impact, explicit or implicit, of every additional ton of CO2 or equivalents added to the atmosphere. So it tries to put together into a single dollar number very diverse impacts, including human deaths caused by climate change, damages to infrastructure, agricultural losses, lost business productivity. And the advantage is obviously there's a lot of methodological issues with trying to squeeze all of that into a single number, but the idea is it can help with a lot of analysis to have it as one number. It has become a key metric for evaluating climate mitigation policies. So it can be used as a shadow price to make policy choices, both in government and in business. You can evaluate, in other words, if there's a proposed policy which will cost $500 per ton of CO2, and the social cost of carbon is only, to pick a number that you'll see relevant later, at $200 a ton, that policy might be somewhat questionable. And in fact, in the work I'm doing on California, there are a host of programs in the state that cost well over $1,000 per ton of CO2. And I think it's pretty hard to justify those in terms of climate benefits. There might be some other social benefits, so I'm not saying they're all bad, but they don't make a whole lot of sense from a climate mitigation perspective. You can also use this kind of metric when you're comparing different kinds of policies. So a carbon price at $50 a ton might fall well below the social cost of carbon, meaning you would be justified, putting politics aside, you would be justified in driving up your carbon price, maybe all the way to $200. But if you've got regulations that are also involved in climate mitigation that are costing, say, $300 a ton, then you know that your carbon price isn't doing enough work and your regulations are probably doing too much work. And you should rebalance from a cost benefit perspective. And last but not least, the reason the Trump administration and other climate skeptics despise it is this metric makes the cost of inaction so clear. It can make clear just how huge the benefits of climate mitigation are. Well, let's look first at some of the changing estimates over time. The social cost of carbon really came into widespread use on the federal level under President Obama, when a working group he set up, their back of the envelope calculation set the social cost of carbon at about $50 per ton of CO2. As soon as President Trump took over in his first administration, he largely wiped that out, coming up with an estimate of somewhere between $1 and $7 per ton, which is pretty much a justification for total inaction. Once Biden got in, we saw a reversal. They drove the social cost of carbon back to where it had been under President Obama and called for new studies. And in 2022, we started seeing the first of several important, really big studies that were driven by considerations that have been outlined by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And their study, published in Nature, came up with an estimate of $185 per ton. This was based on newer assessments of damages caused by global warming and a consensus, very hard reached, on how to weigh future costs in terms of present dollars, which is very important because much of the damage of climate change will be in the future. And how do we bring that back to the present? That's a big methodological question. So we've seen that the social cost of carbon in the official estimates has bounced around. In general, I would say estimates are growing and growing fairly fast. A very influential paper in Nature last year concluded that the world economy is committed to an income reduction of 19% within the next 26 years, based on sort of current projected trends in climate. These damages already outweigh the mitigation costs required to limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade by 6-fold. What that means is people who complain about the cost are simply missing the point that the cost of mitigation is only 1/6 of the cost of doing nothing. So you'd have to be brain dead not to want to step in and try to mitigate climate change while you can. Another 2024 study found that every degree centigrade of warming cuts labor productivity by 1.2%. And over 30 years, such an effect would slash productivity, which is the source of all economic productivity engine and growth, by 35%. You can see this chart on the right shows a bunch of different estimates over time of economic damages that were estimated from every degree of warming. And you can see a lot of them were pretty small. These are mostly by economists. And economists have tended over time to really downplay damage estimates. Some other professions have been a little more robust in their estimates. But economists now, these most recent ones are coming up with vastly greater estimates. So that shows a really seismic shift in that profession. So there are a bunch of important caveats that I think we all need to keep in mind when we bandy about these estimates. First of all, a lot of losses are not caused by climate, but are caused by rising population and more building in risk-prone areas. And I see that all the time in California when people may ascribe the huge cost from wildfires in the state to climate change. And there's no doubt that climate change is drying the state out, making droughts worse, increasing temperatures that make fires more likely. But probably a dominant factor in California is rising pressure, building more and more building in zones that interfaces, kind of wilderness interfaces that raise risks from fires. So that has to be acknowledged. Secondly, not all impacts are negative. Warming increases agricultural productivity in colder countries, like Canada and parts of Russia. And deaths in many colder areas actually exceeded, the deaths from cold exposure have in general exceeded deaths from heat exposure for much of human history. So warming can actually reduce deaths in some areas. Thirdly, when you hear estimates of big GDP losses from climate change, you have to remember that those are losses relative to what could take place in the future if we mitigated climate. So even huge estimates of GDP reductions still acknowledge that overall GDP is likely to grow very substantially over time, even with climate change. It just won't grow as fast. So we're foregoing potential riches, but we're not necessarily getting absolutely poorer. And the last thing to see, and you can kind of study this graph later on your own, but is this represents two different studies, but it represents gigantic error-bound estimates as shown by all these different shadings. And so as you can see, this is not an absolute science. When someone quotes you a number, there's a huge error bound around it. So compounding the problem is that, and the reason for these huge error bounds is there are a lot of things that we simply can't measure at current time, including we don't know for sure how much warming there will be. There are also unknown unknowns, things like climate tipping points that we can't even predict, much less measure. And it's very likely that if we somehow had a crystal ball and could measure all of these unknowns into our models, it would have a very dramatic upward impact on estimates of the social cost of carbon. These two charts show at left estimates of damage over time. You'll see the social cost of carbon rising over time as global temperatures are expected to warm. On the right, you'll see those estimates are increased almost tenfold with, and this is a complex methodology which I can't really explain to you, but these authors attempted to kind of guesstimate some of these unknowns and showed that if those uncertainties could be factored in, it would have a very gigantic effect on estimates of the social cost of carbon. A big EPA study of the social cost of carbon issued in 2022 outlined what some of these unknowns are. As they put it, there are still many important categories of climate impacts and associated damages that are not yet reflected in these estimates due to data and modeling limitations. So those included the probability of extreme temperatures, perhaps changing over time, damages associated with changes in precipitation or humidity, and potentially large-scale Earth system changes, those tipping points I talked about, or things like ocean acidification, and so forth. So we should not be comforted by any low estimate of the social cost of carbon. It's probably a lot bigger than we know. So for the purpose of this presentation and audience, I'm going to focus more now on sort of the health component to the social cost of carbon. Way back in 2009, Lancet, leading medical journal, concluded that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 20th century. But most models of the social cost of carbon did a very poor job of capturing human mortality costs. And a big breakthrough came in 2021 with a publication in Nature Communications by a guy named Bressler, who calculated that basically for every, and don't take this precision too much to heart, but for a little over 4,000 tons of carbon emissions, it would cause one excess death globally. And when he factored these excess deaths in, it increased the social cost of carbon estimate from $37 per ton to $258 per ton of CO2 or equivalent. So that's taking mortality risk into account, as previous models had not, had a gigantic upward impact on these estimates. And he indicated over on the right, this so-called DICE baseline scenario was one cooked up by economists, and it had a fairly high degree of warming, basically they thought that 3.5 degrees centigrade was an acceptable degree of warming. And he showed that, in fact, it would result in, can't even see, 83 million excess deaths, which really had not been evaluated by those previous economic models. And that the vast majority of those deaths could be averted by holding global warming down to 2.4 degrees centigrade. So that was a great argument for much more ambitious climate mitigation. Another paper that came out just a year later by a whole group of scholars led by Kevin Cromar also called attention to what they called the critical need to update the health portion of social cost GHG estimates. They use that instead of carbon, GHG. And they made a couple of points that this is a lot of verbiage, so you can kind of read this later. But the first is, and I am going to go into this in just a moment, there are a bunch of impacts that come from the burning of fossil fuels that are separate from the direct impacts of climate change. So we all know impacts on human health, and again, I'm going to talk a lot about this, of fine particulates, ozone, and so forth. This paper pointed out that all of those costs you might think would be included in a social cost of carbon estimate, and they are not. And the reason is they are not direct impacts of climate. They are secondary impacts of burning fossil fuels. So this paper pointed out that they should continue to be directly accounted for in any benefit cost analysis of decarbonization. So if you decarbonize, there are at least two separate strands of benefits. One is the climate benefit, but the other is the benefit from reduced air pollution. But they pointed out that there is a valid area that is not adequately modeled under the social cost of carbon. And that is, in the second paragraph, for example, emissions of air pollutants that would not otherwise occur. For example, if global warming increases wildfires, which increases particulate emissions, which kills people, that is a valid cost to be attributed to climate change. So their point is there's still a lot of room for adding climate impacts on health into social cost of carbon estimates. Now let's go to that earlier point, which is all these other attendant health costs of burning fossil fuels that really do impact any kind of reasonable discussion of weighing the costs and benefits of decarbonization strategies. And I'm not going to read through all of these bullets. I wanted mostly to leave these behind as a bunch of data sources, some of which you're probably already familiar with, but perhaps there are a few that you're not. Basically, just a host of high-quality studies show millions of premature deaths and billions of days of added illness caused by air pollution from fine particulates and other sources. And the World Bank estimated that the global cost of health damages associated with exposure to such air pollution was $8 trillion, or 6% of global GDP. Just gigantic. And in the US, air pollution has been estimated to cost about 5% of GDP in damages. And I do cite a paper you may not know of from the Annual Review of Resource Economics that does a good job of pulling a lot of key literature together. Here's a more recent paper from 2023 from British Medical Journal, estimating that more than 5 million excess deaths per year could be avoided by phasing out fossil fuels. You're probably all familiar with Drew Schindle's work because CCL has done a lot to promote it. And he made kind of similar estimates of the reduction in premature deaths, hospitalizations, lost work days, and so forth that would be could be the benefits that we could see from keeping to a 2 degrees centigrade pathway. A more recent paper, which I find extremely interesting, and thus I'm going to have 3 slides on this, broke down reduced air emissions from different sectors: electricity generation, transportation, buildings, and industrial sources, in terms of estimating the reduced annual premature deaths and the monetary benefits. So if you want to look at a decarbonization strategy and its impact on these sectors, you can use this paper to get a pretty good estimate of health co-benefits. And again, there's a lot of fine print here, but basically this is a reproduction of one of his charts. And so he's looking at health endpoints here: premature adult mortality, morbidity, infant mortality, respiratory hospital admissions, asthma room visits, emergency visits, lost work days, and so forth. So it's a great data source. And here he breaks it down by the polluting sector, which again I find useful because many decarbonization scenarios will show impacts by sector. So here you can see the avoided premature deaths and the monetized benefits from each of these sectors. A study done by the American Lung Association similarly looked at the transportation sector and moving towards zero emission vehicles, and the benefits there in terms of premature deaths avoided, asthma attacks avoided, lost work days avoided, and so forth. Again, just the main point of all of this is simply to provide more sources in case any of these you haven't already seen. And lastly, here are a couple of slightly old estimates, but it is pretty obvious that carbon pricing, in whatever form it takes, we all know or should know is probably the most powerful and cost-effective approach to climate mitigation. And it does so by, of course, discouraging the burning of fossil fuels and encouraging substitution of cleaner forms of energy and more efficient use of energy. Those two combined give you the benefit. So it naturally stands to benefit that a rising carbon price should have attendant co-benefits to human health and the economy from reducing fossil fuel burning. And here are just a couple of studies that I found that kind of directly draw that link. One of these was done by the modeling firm REMI in 2014. It's a look at regional US premature deaths that would be saved from a carbon fee and dividend, similar to CCL's model. Oh, okay. So that's, and this study from Columbia University shows how carbon fees under the Energy Innovation Act, which of course is no longer particularly moot, but if we ever revived it, would absolutely slash NOx, sulfur dioxide, and mercury emissions, thus having extremely positive effect on human health. So just to conclude here, climate skeptics who focus endlessly on the cost of climate mitigation, which they always think is too excessive, but do not look at the vast cost of climate change, are really kind of prescribing social bankruptcy. Climate mitigation is an investment, not a cost. At the same time, the climate crisis shouldn't be an excuse for signing blank checks. Not every mitigation action is worth the cost. And that's why the social cost of carbon is such a good tool for evaluating costs and benefits. But it's an imperfect tool. Estimates of the social cost of carbon are subject to large changes as ongoing research further hones our ability to predict changes from climate and their human impacts. Even with these uncertainties, it's still an invaluable analytical tool. And more people working on these tools have come to appreciate just how important and critical human health impacts are, especially mortality, in devising any kind of credible value for the social cost of carbon. And again, further research, which will be hard to do at the national level under the current administration, but hopefully will be done in Europe and through independent scholars, will help further cement our understanding of these costs and benefits. And with that, I would be happy to throw it open for questions, and I'll arrange to get a copy of this, probably in PDF form, maybe to Lori or whomever, or Lisa, and so that you guys, if you're interested, can take a closer look at some of these slides, because I know that there was a lot of dense material, some of which may have gone by pretty fast.
That would be great, Jonathan. That was fantastic. You are so knowledgeable on this topic, and it's so relevant to human health. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We actually, a lot of us were just on a call last week with the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, and Kevin Cromar was presenting on the fact that New York University is going to, over the next year or two, work on recreating the health cost for the social cost of carbon. And I think what he said, the one sentence I remembered, because I knew we were having this talk this week, was that excess heat mortality was the only human death thing that was added into the social cost of carbon. Does that sound correct?
That's pretty much true. And here he was saying in this 2022 paper that we need to look at other channels. For example, if climate change induces an increase in air pollutants, those air pollutants could then kill people. However, when all of that is said and done, some of these estimates of excess heat deaths sort of take that into account, because what scientists do is they do statistical modeling based on observed deaths correlated with heat levels. They don't necessarily track all the different channels by which that excess heat creates the deaths. And they don't necessarily need to. That's certainly a very interesting topic. But someone doing high-level modeling can say, we don't need to know all the channels. All we need to know is that, based on this data from Bangladesh, every time the temperature hit 120 degrees, we got these many extra deaths, and do that all around the world. So there are refinements that are needed, as Cromar and others have said, but some of the current statistical work already subsumes a lot of those different channels into one number.
Well, they want allies like from the medical societies and perhaps other universities and stuff to work with them on this. So if anyone's interested, I think Rob or Lisa can look up his his contact info.
Great.
Open it up to questions here. Joanne?
Joanne?
Thanks so much, Jonathan. That was amazing. And thank you for reminding me of some studies. And actually, there were some new ones. So I really appreciate your offer to forward your information as a PDF, because I think it's helpful to those of us who are trying to talk. And my question, I guess, is more for the group. And this kind of conversation, it to me, I think it's a really important thing timing wise, even given the contingencies of the federal government. And that is because I'm seeing a need more and more for us to refocus on not being afraid to talk about climate change as climate change, and stop couching things in terms of energy economics and those sorts of things, number one, and to focus on this as a moral issue in a way that makes it harder for people to ignore. And I think this data is really an inroad into doing that. I feel like we've kind of lost a little bit of that, maybe partly due to the IRA and all the technicalities in terms of economy and everything. Sure. And so my question for the group is, what do we think is actionable here? Like Lisa, this strikes me as we haven't done at least I haven't done our MedPage op-ed. Maybe this is the framework that we could use for that. Or, is there a way to work with Dr. Cromer? I have his email, and I'll put that in the chat in a minute. Or what other ideas do members of this group have about how to use this either in terms of messaging or policy work moving forward? Thanks.
Jonathan,
could I jump in, and pardon me because I've already talked so much, but I have sort of three comments on that. One is, just speaking personally, climate change itself as a term doesn't begin to really convey the severity. Change is good sometimes. So I think of it as climate disruption. So that's me personally. Sad to say, my own personal taste in terminology doesn't necessarily translate well into what convinces the public. So I have, for several years now, been urging people to stop going purely by their own intuition and start supporting studies or looking for studies that are careful of what actually moves the needle on public opinion. And there are, CCL has been very slow in doing that, but we did have some presentations, to the national calls by some market research firms that have given us good insights into what kinds of terminology works. And so my view is, in terms of trying to get change, whatever works is the best terminology. And of course, that may differ depending on the audience. So speaking to a Republican or a conservative, you may need to focus on energy security, and to a different audience, different terminology. But third, and perhaps most important for this particular topic area, and this is relevant, say, to California, where, as I mentioned, the state is trying to reauthorize its signature carbon pricing program, the cap and trade program. And we have great affordability problems in the state. And so one of the things I'm doing is trying to use cap and trade revenue in the way that CCL promotes the dividend to lower household costs. So cap and trade is viewed as an ally rather than a net, cost to people. But the other thing is, okay, why should we have cap and trade at all? The cap and trade program reduces California's emissions, but the reduced emissions in California have absolutely zero measurable effect on California's climate. We just don't emit enough to move the needle. Climate is a global problem. It's the global atmosphere that determines what kind of warming takes place. So I've been arguing we need to focus on the co-benefits of decarbonization. And those are very heavily in the health sector. So I think that, those of you interested in health should be saying the reason we want to promote the IRA, the reason we want to promote clean energy, in addition to setting a good example for the world on climate, which is critically important, absolutely, but also because of these vast numbers of other health impacts. And that, I devoted 5 or 6 slides to, and all of you are very familiar with that literature. That has an immediate impact on people's health, an immediate impact not only on whether they're going to die or go to the hospital, but on their productivity, their lost work days, their kids staying home because of asthma. That's why you should, be fighting to restore incentives for clean energy and discourage fossil fuels. So I actually think a shift just a little bit away from focus on climate and focus a little more on here and now human health impacts from fossil fuels might be the most effective strategy for reaching the public.
We'll let Jay go in just in just a second, but Jonathan, if you have that written into any of your thoughtful papers and things that you have done, it would be really nice to share that with us. I'm sure you probably explained it a little more even.
I probably don't, but maybe you can figure out what I said from your recording.
Okay, Jay, take it away.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good question before, and it's been a place I've been putting a lot of thought into, right? That, as part of it is how do we build relational capital to get people to understand and maybe connect better, right? Part of what we're going through right now is the lack of understanding of the common good and what does that represent. And the interesting thing for me is that between medical professionals and clinicians, and in this case, between faith-based organizations, which really talk about that moral imperative through faith, through things like Catholic social teaching, is an opportunity to bring people together around relational capital building that goes beyond just the physical things. There was 2, I thought, podcasts today that were really very good. It's one that Nate Hagans has been pushing on the Great Simplification, and there's another one by the New York Times that was really about therapy for relationships, of saying that in the middle of all this, we've maybe have forgotten that sometimes that in the past of mankind, it was done through 250,000 years of having to depend on each other to be able to solve problems and not just survive, but to thrive. And maybe we've forgotten some of that. We need to kind of remember that. And how do we come back? And maybe that's the opportunity around this idea of a spiritual awakening around health and how we live and how we take care of each other, in part through faith, if you want to call it that. And it could be religious, it could be spiritual. We call it many different things, of reigniting that. And so that's been part of my interest lately in doing that. So I just wanted to point that out. We're getting ready to push out a podcast series called People, Planet, and Health, where we're actually going to touch on the health connection with sustainability with people through the context of Catholic social teaching. And the press release for that should go out from the Atlanta Archdiocese this week. And we've got a series of 6 with Dr. Larry McVoy, who I think participated in one of our Health Action Team webinars as well. So anyway, I just wanted to maybe put that out as a place of investment that goes beyond just the traditional policy of how do we build a better view for people to understand and see the common good, which leads to the public good, which is the policy piece. And maybe we need to spend a little bit of time and effort doing that. And that's kind of where I'm spending some of my time, which is why I find these conversations really interesting.
Jonathan, if you want to talk about what you have up, that would
Yes.
be great. But also maybe put that link in the chat, and then when you're done talking about it, let's maybe quit screen sharing just so we can.
Great ideas. Let's see here. Chat. So this is a report that came out in 2020 from an outfit, Climate Exchange, on the health and climate benefits that they together greatly outweigh the costs of California's climate mitigation efforts. In it, there was a very interesting chart, this figure 1, which showed on the far left the implemented funding for California's climate programs, at eyeballing it like a little over $4 billion. And interestingly enough, the what you might call the GHG reduction benefits, which probably based on the then estimates of the social cost of carbon, are actually a bit lower than the cost. That didn't look very good. If the climate benefits are less than the cost of mitigation, why do it? But then you see the health co-benefits from doing these climate programs are enormous and basically 4 times greater than the cost of the climate mitigation programs. And you put the two together and you're up to nearly 5 times greater benefits over costs. And so again, I think this kind of approach can be very persuasive to people who don't know what to think about the climate debate, have heard all sorts of misinformation and disinformation and so on and so forth, but who might be inclined to believe the just vast number of papers by epidemiologists, health scientists, and others, and who may have personal experience with things like asthma coming from impure air quality and so forth, and thus much more inclined to believe these numbers. Whereas climate is such an abstract thing, and it's hard for people to really be sure of, is it just hotter this year, or is that in fact part of climate change, who to believe, and so on and so forth. So again, I think for a lot of reasons, people in the climate movement might want to start focusing on the huge kind of immediate co-benefits to human beings from decarbonization. Not that we want to use the word decarbonization, but for those of you here, I'll go ahead and use it as a one-word tool.
Thanks. Lisa, before you go, Joanne put a thoughtful comment in the chat, and wondering if either you can say it out loud, Joanne, or Jonathan can read it in the chat and comment.
Joanne, why don't you say it, please?
I don't live in a particularly Republican area, so I'm probably talking out of the side of my mouth. But part of my comment earlier was that I feel like that the position that we have both as healthcare providers and as climate advocates really is kind of the moral high ground at its core. And if we get so practical in, the clean energy economy, blah, 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 other things, and we lose the message of the moral imperative, I feel that in the long term, in terms of really changing minds and hearts, maybe we've not been doing ourselves a favor. And so that was the comment in the chat. And maybe that's something we could talk about more. We just had this conversation in regards to an op-ed that we're submitting in my state about the IRA and, how much to talk about the bigger picture. So,
and if you'll excuse me for repeating myself, much of this debate over rhetoric has been binary. Should we talk about climate, or should we talk about things like energy security? And I think many people here would agree, and Joanne, directly to your point, a lot of people on both sides of the partisan divide care about human health and the health of their children. And part of the point is you don't need to say, well, we should be caring about the fate of our children 30 years from now. What happens in 2050 if the climate gets here? We can talk about, what about the fate of our children right now? with these health impacts. So I think we can, again, cross the partisan divide with this discussion of health. It's a moral issue. It's an issue that hits us all personally. It has tremendous science behind it. And so I strongly encourage all of you to take up this banner. I know you have been for a number of years, but I'm just supporting that. Lisa, what did you?
Yeah, great talk and great discussion. And yeah, I think a lot of people on this call have been taking this on. Two things. One, I think, at least in my experience, when you try to go towards the moral imperative associated with air pollution, a lot of the rural areas which tend to line up with the more conservative areas are not the areas that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution. And so when you make that air pollution health impact argument, it resonates less strongly than you would hope that it would. At least it's certainly, I brought health professionals into my conservative member of Congress, and it's been, whew, and I brought things many, many times to him, met with him both as a health organization and as CCL. We have a very cordial relationship and a good relationship, but I have not ever seen the health impacts resonate with him, which is really disappointing. Not having said that, I still think your point is valid, and I have always shown away from trying to speak to. I'm frightened of going to the moral impact because it sounds sort of self-righteous, and that's hard for me to. It's past my comfort zone, but it's also very true. And so maybe I need to just kick myself in the butt and get there and be willing to go to that point. I love the data that you have, and I'm very appreciative of this. And this is a little in the weeds, and I may have missed it. But you said that there was one chart that went by sector that looked at I think the health co-benefits of decarbonizing. And so one effort that a lot of us are working on is in trying, and this is nowhere near as impactful as, a national carbon fee and dividend policy would be, but trying to get our healthcare systems to decarbonize. So I wondered if you noticed, and there you can really do moral imperative. We have all made an oath of first doing no harm. And if we could, show very effectively that the healthcare sector, we know that it's, a huge source of greenhouse gases. About 8.5% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions come from the healthcare sector. But it would be really nice to be able to correlate it with the human health impacts. I mean, we know what the impacts are, but to monetarily mention them, I think would be helpful. Do you remember if it covered that at all?
It certainly didn't. That's a kind of micro sector in a sense. But I think depending on the sources of the emissions, if it's, for example, largely from energy use, then it's pretty simple. You just kind of, you have data on these overall impacts, let's say 5 trillion to the US economy and so many deaths from burning of fossil fuels. If the healthcare industry contributes 8% of that,
Yeah.
do the back of the envelope and say, you know what?
It's
If
about
we're
such and
off
such.
by 20%, big deal,
A big part of it is fluoride related anesthetics, although we have been getting them out of the ORs, which would not be directly,
okay.
fossil fuel based air pollutants. But I just thought that if that data were there, that would be really handy. So
But
thanks.
certainly, yeah, I mean, the healthcare sector can and should be highly sensitive to those, even if it's a smaller percentage than we think or whatever. Every bit helps. And the only other thing I would say, which would be really interesting, and I don't have good data on it, but if we could induce someone to do a little study, one of the studies was the 2022 study of impacts of climate change that have not well been monetized into health impacts. So if rising temperatures, for example, increase average wind speeds, they could be driving more dust, blowing in rural areas and creating more particulate pollution, more asthma, and so forth. If it's drying out soils, it would have the same effect. Not every coal-fired power plant is located in a city. Some of them are blowing the downwind into rural areas or, lightly populated suburban areas. So there are a whole host of things. And what I would urge you or others to do, maybe some research on any given member of Congress's geographic area, and just brainstorm what you may not quantify it to some high level of precision, but say, hey, you just can't ignore it just because you haven't thought about it. You're not immune.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And an example, and I don't know if other people are familiar with this, but the Wisconsin Healthy Climate Wisconsin partnered with the Union of Concerned Scientists to look very specifically at two rice plants, reciprocal internal combustion plants that use natural gas to burn, and we're able to show the health impacts and the deaths and the increase asthma, et cetera, down to a very specific geographic area. So that's a great example, Jonathan.
Great.
Well, this is a fantastic conversation, but I don't want us to go over. I apologize for us meeting on Memorial Day as it is. Jonathan, can we share your email or not now that you're not a staffer?
Yes. Yeah, the JV Marcia 7
Okay.
can, sure.
Okay.
And I will send to the three of you, Lori, Lisa, and Joanna, a PDF, which you can then share with anyone else who's interested.
Will do.
Great.
Thank you so much. Have a good Memorial Day evening, guys.
Thank you all. Yep. Great to meet
Thank
you.
you.
Yep. Take care. Bye-bye.